Cop denies black woman boarding. Stunned to discover she's the CEO of the airline. Imagine you're rushing through the bustling halls of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, heart racing, desperate not to miss your flight. You spot a commotion at the gate. A stern-faced police officer is blocking a black woman from boarding, dismissing her ticket and yelling loudly enough for everyone around to stop in their tracks. Before you can even grasp what's happening, the woman stands her ground, calm but firm. Little does anyone know, least of all the harsh officer, that beneath her unassuming appearance is a powerful secret. She is the CEO of the very airline he's denying her access to. Prepare to witness a shocking revelation. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport buzzed with its usual morning energy. Car tires screeched at the curb as drivers rushed to unload luggage. Bleary-eyed passengers navigated check-in counters, and announcements echoed overhead. The hum of voices mingled with the occasional roar of planes taking off in the distance. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the large glass windows, the airport was alive with anticipation. People were either lost in thought or absorbed in conversation, each carrying their own hopes and anxieties for the journey ahead. In the middle of this scene stood Officer Donovan Myers. He was a man who took great pride in maintaining order. At 6 feet 2 inches with a muscular build, a crisp uniform, and a steely gaze, Donovan appeared every bit the vigilant airport cop. He'd been in this role for over a decade, ushering travelers, arresting pickpockets, and breaking up minor scuffles. While he was undeniably good at his job, there was an undercurrent to his behavior that few discussed, except among those who'd felt it. He tended to judge people based on their ethnicity, attire, or accent, often letting his version of order spill into biased assumptions and prejudiced remarks. That morning, Donovan was particularly alert. He'd received a vague tip about possible contraband or suspicious activity, which made him uneasy. He roamed the terminal, scanning faces, checking tickets, and intervening wherever he sensed trouble. Unfortunately, his sense of trouble was often skewed by stereotypes. People of color, in his eyes, often warranted extra scrutiny. Inside Terminal B, the security line stretched longer than usual. Passengers shuffled forward, pulling out IDs, untying shoes, and juggling their bags. Among them was Meredith Cole, a composed black woman in her mid-40s. By all outward appearances, she was just another traveler trying to catch her flight. She wore simple black slacks, a pastel blouse, and a light jacket with no visible branding or indication of status. Her short, natural curls framed a serene face, calm but observant, as she quietly absorbed the world around her. What no one, including Donovan, realized was that Meredith was the CEO of Skyway Connect, a regional airline that worked closely with several major carriers nationwide. She had been conducting undercover inspections for several months to investigate complaints about her airline's customer service. She wanted to experience firsthand how passengers were treated and how staff responded to unforeseen challenges. To do so, she traveled incognito, using a different name, dressing down, and engaging with the crew as though she were just another passenger. As Meredith advanced in line, an elderly man in front of her struggled to untie his shoes. She leaned down, offering a kind smile and helping him. The man expressed his thanks, clearly relieved. It was a small gesture, but it reflected Meredith's personality. Patient, empathetic, and humble. However, this simple act triggered Donovan's suspicion. Who was this woman? Was she hiding something? Donovan's mind worked in overdrive, convinced that he needed to investigate further. He grabbed his radio, adrenaline surging, deciding to keep a watchful eye on her. He didn't realize that this moment would soon escalate into a confrontation that would shake the entire airport. By the time Meredith reached her gate, B-23, an announcement rang out overhead. Boarding for Skyway Connect Flight 3045 to Chicago O'Hare would begin shortly. She felt a small surge of pride hearing the flight number, even though she was traveling incognito. She had helped plan that route, worked on partnerships with major carriers, and spent countless late nights ensuring it ran smoothly. Today, she was simply another passenger, observing to see whether recent complaints about rude staff had any truth. The gate area was crowded with travelers. A weary mother calming a restless toddler, a business traveler typing on his laptop, and families chatting excitedly about their upcoming trips. Meredith found a seat by the large windows, her carry-on bag neatly placed at her feet. She gazed at the planes outside, watching them lift off into the clear blue sky. The sight reminded her why she loved the industry. It connected people, made distances feel shorter, and opened up the world. Suddenly, the intercom crackled. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the pre-boarding announcement for Flight 3045 to Chicago O'Hare. We will begin boarding shortly with passengers needing special assistance." The gate agent, Stephanie Brooks, looked exhausted but tried to keep her tone upbeat as she repeated instructions about checking in large carry-ons, seat upgrades, and frequent flyer benefits. Meredith paid attention to every detail, carefully observing the agent's tone, eye contact, and professionalism. So far, so good. Stephanie seemed overworked but still managed to maintain a courteous demeanor. However, as boarding began, Meredith noticed a discrepancy. An older couple had paid for priority boarding, but they complained their request hadn't been reflected on their passes. Stephanie apologized politely, fidgeting with her computer. She seemed flustered. "I'm sorry for the confusion," she said, scanning their boarding passes. After a few keystrokes, she nodded. "Yes, it looks like the system didn't capture your pre-boarding status. Let me fix that." She handed them new passes, smiling. "Enjoy your flight." The couple seemed relieved. Meredith made a mental note of the glitch. It indicated that somewhere in the system, upgrades weren't being properly recorded. She'd have to look into that, but that was precisely why she was here, to observe such issues and address them back in the boardroom. Absorbed in her thoughts, Meredith didn't notice Officer Donovan Myers stepping into the gate area, scanning the crowd. Donovan's sharp gaze landed on Meredith. There was something about her calm demeanor, the way she had helped that elderly man earlier, that unsettled him. He found her quiet confidence suspicious, particularly since he had already decided from a distance that she might be up to something. People who appeared too calm, in his mind, could be hiding something bigger. He approached the gate podium. "Morning, miss," he said, tipping his hat to Stephanie. She paused mid-announcement, startled by his approach. "Everything all right here?" Donovan asked in a stern tone. Stephanie forced a polite smile. "Yes, officer, we're just starting to board. Can I help you with something?" Donovan nodded toward Meredith. "That woman there," he said, pointing with the slightest tilt of his chin. "Traveling alone?" Stephanie frowned, glancing over at Meredith. "I believe so, yes. Is there a problem?" "I just want to make sure she's cleared to board," Donovan replied, his tone implying suspicion. "You might want to check her ticket again. She could be carrying something she shouldn't." Stephanie hesitated. Airport security had already screened everyone's carry-ons, but the last thing she wanted was to argue with a law enforcement officer in the middle of a busy terminal. "I can scan her boarding pass again," she said cautiously. "If that would make you feel more comfortable, officer." Donovan nodded sharply, feeling validated by the agent's compliance. The truth was, he had no real evidence. He was relying on a vague hunch that often surfaced when he saw travelers of color who seemed too comfortable. Donovan justified it as caution, not racism, but the pattern was consistent. Stephanie made the overhead announcement for the next boarding group, and passengers lined up, rummaging for IDs and boarding passes. Meredith stepped into line, calm and collected. By now, she was used to small incidents of racial bias in her life, though she had no idea how quickly this one would escalate. As she neared the podium, Stephanie spotted Donovan out of the corner of her eye and gave a tight nod. "May I see your boarding pass and ID again, please?" Stephanie asked politely. Meredith, momentarily puzzled, complied. She had just scanned her ticket moments ago when entering the gate area. However, she handed over her driver's license and boarding pass with a warm smile. "Of course," she said. "Is there a problem?" "Just a standard recheck," Stephanie replied, trying to keep her tone professional. She swiped the boarding pass again, and the system approved it without issue. She handed it back. "All set, Miss Cole." Then she looked at Donovan, silently indicating everything was clear. Donovan, however, didn't move. He wanted something more. "Actually, ma'am," he said, addressing Meredith directly, "I need a word with you. Step aside, please." Meredith raised an eyebrow but remained composed. "Certainly," she replied, stepping away from the boarding line with her small carry-on. The eyes of other passengers flicked toward them, some curious, others concerned. A hush began to settle over the area, the air thick with the anticipation of a brewing confrontation. Stephanie shifted uncomfortably behind the podium, uncertain whether she should intervene or continue with boarding. Meanwhile, Donovan led Meredith to a corner near the gate windows, out of earshot of the crowd. Meredith met his gaze evenly. "How can I help you, officer?" she asked, her voice calm. The question hung between them. Donovan's jaw tightened. He still couldn't pinpoint a specific reason for his suspicion, but he felt a vague, growing unease. He resorted to a standard line. "I just want to ensure everything is in order. You came through security alone, correct?" "Yes, I did," Meredith replied calmly, "as do countless travelers each day." Donovan's frustration flared at her composed response. "Is that carry-on your only luggage?" "Yes, officer," Meredith answered respectfully but unwavering. "I'm on a short trip, so I'm packing light." The exchange, though outwardly polite, crackled with tension. Meredith could sense what Donovan was doing, but she needed to remain undercover and keep a low profile. The last thing she wanted was a scene before she even boarded the plane. After all, she had come to inspect the airline's operations in secret. Yet the glaring injustice of it all was hard to ignore, especially for someone like Meredith, who believed in fostering a welcoming and fair experience for all passengers. Donovan gestured as though he intended to search her bag. Meredith unzipped it without hesitation, revealing neatly folded clothes, a tablet, a small toiletry bag, and some business documents that lacked a company logo. Donovan rifled through the items, clearly disappointed when he found nothing incriminating. However, when he came across the business documents, flight schedules, and operational data for Skyway Connect, he paused. "These look official," he remarked. Meredith nodded, a hint of tension crossing her face for the first time. "I work in the airline industry," was all she said. She wasn't ready to expose her true purpose yet. Donovan stared at her for a few lingering moments. The only conclusion he could draw was that she might be a lower-level employee of the airline, perhaps a gate agent or flight attendant, which, in his mind, only deepened his suspicion. Why would someone in such a position be traveling under a different airline's flight pass? It didn't add up. To Donovan, this was a puzzle, and puzzles like these seemed to always confirm his preconceived beliefs. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "All right," he said, "but I'll be watching." Meredith nodded and reclaimed her belongings. "Thank you, officer," she said, managing to keep her tone polite. With that, she returned to the boarding line, ignoring the curious gazes from other passengers. As she scanned her boarding pass at the podium, Stephanie avoided her gaze, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. She gestured for Meredith to proceed onto the jet bridge. The tension in the air lingered even after Meredith disappeared from sight. Donovan remained by the gate, arms folded, determined to see this through. He had no solid reason to escalate things, not yet, but he trusted his instincts. The morning had started with tension, and it was far from over. Meredith found her seat in business class, 3A, next to a window overlooking the vast tarmac. She settled in, placing her carry-on in the overhead compartment. The seat was comfortable enough, offering plenty of legroom and plush upholstery. A flight attendant, Jenny Caldwell, approached to welcome her. "Good morning. Mississippi, may I offer you a pre-flight beverage? We have orange juice or water available." Meredith glanced around. Several other passengers in business class were already sipping drinks. Normally, she might have declined, but part of her mission was to assess whether the airline service was consistent. "Yes, I'll take some water, please," she replied with a smile. Jenny nodded and returned shortly with a small plastic cup filled with water. She placed it on Meredith's tray table and handed her a menu for the in-flight meals. "Our flight time is just over 2 hours," Jenny said. "We'll be serving breakfast shortly after takeoff." Meredith thanked her. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a commotion near the plane's entrance. Officer Donovan Myers was at the cabin door, having what seemed like an intense conversation with another crew member. One of the flight attendants frowned, clearly confused. Eventually, Donovan seemed unsatisfied, but he retreated. This was highly unusual. Police officers didn't typically linger at airplane entrances unless there was a serious issue. Meredith tried to refocus on her mission. She flipped through the in-flight magazine, occasionally checking her phone for emails, though she hadn't logged into the airport Wi-Fi under her real identity. She had a mental checklist: evaluate cabin cleanliness, staff courtesy, meal quality, and overall efficiency. She also wanted to speak with passengers if time allowed, to gauge their experiences. But her thoughts kept returning to Officer Myers. His behavior was unsettling. She knew what discrimination felt like. This wasn't the first time she had experienced it, and it wouldn't be the last. But the blatant nature of it, especially in front of so many people, made her uneasy. Within minutes, the plane was fully boarded, and the door was sealed. The engines hummed softly, preparing for takeoff. A flight attendant gave the usual safety demonstration, walking the aisle to ensure seatbelts were fastened and tray tables were stowed. Meredith exhaled, letting the sense of calm settle in. Once airborne, she hoped to review her notes and plan how to address any service issues with the corporate office. For now, she just wanted to relax, or at least try. The plane pushed back from the gate, taxied onto the runway, and soon took flight. As the altitude increased, Meredith was pressed back into her seat. She gazed out the window, watching the ground recede and the city of Atlanta spread below like a miniature map. The feeling of taking off into the sky never grew old for her. It was one of the reasons she had dedicated her life to aviation. The wonder, the freedom, the sense that anything was possible once you could lift off. About 20 minutes into the flight, the captain announced they had reached cruising altitude. The flight attendants began serving breakfast. Jenny came by with a tray, offering a choice between an omelet and French toast. Meredith chose the omelet. She was about to open her tray table when her phone vibrated gently in her pocket. Surprised, she realized she had forgotten to switch it to airplane mode. Instinctively, she took it out to turn it off. Glancing at the screen, she saw a text message from a colleague, someone who knew about her undercover mission, saying, "Heard a rumor a security officer gave you trouble. Let me know if everything's okay." Meredith quickly typed back a reassurance that she was fine but would follow up after landing. She then powered off her phone, entirely letting the momentary wave of anxiety pass. Meredith instead refocused on the in-flight experience. She unwrapped her utensils, tasted the omelet, slightly overcooked, and made a mental note. The coffee, however, was strong, which she considered a positive. Across the aisle, a couple chatted about their connecting flight. "I just hope we don't miss our connection," the woman said with concern. Meredith leaned over and politely inquired if they had been informed about any possible delays. They shook their heads, so she offered to check with the flight attendants. It was another opportunity to observe how the crew handled passenger concerns. As Meredith finished her breakfast, Jenny returned. "Everything okay?" she asked, directing her question to Meredith and the couple across the aisle. "Everything's fine," Meredith said, carefully choosing her words. "The omelet was just a bit dry, but otherwise good. These folks across the aisle are worried about their connecting flight. Any update on arrival time?" Jenny nodded sympathetically. "We're expecting to land on time, maybe even a few minutes early. I'll double-check with the cockpit and come back with a more precise update." "Would that help?" The couple smiled, relieved. Meredith nodded. So far, Jenny was performing well in terms of courtesy, attentiveness, and helpfulness. Another positive note on her mental checklist. Then, a flicker of memory crossed Meredith's mind. Donovan's suspicious stare, that subtle feeling of being targeted. She shook it off. She was thousands of feet in the air now, presumably out of range for any immediate trouble from Officer Myers. The flight continued smoothly, with only light turbulence that caused the seat belt sign to flicker on a few times. Otherwise, it was a routine journey. Unbeknownst to Meredith, trouble was already brewing on the ground. Donovan had spoken to the gate staff after the plane had departed, probing for more information about this mysterious passenger. When he learned she worked in the airline industry, his suspicion only grew. "She's not wearing a uniform," Donovan had insisted. The gate staff, caught off guard, politely explained that corporate employees often traveled for business out of uniform, especially if they were managers or higher. But Donovan wasn't convinced. He left the terminal with a tense jaw and a determination to follow up with the airline's administration. He was sure he'd uncover something nefarious if he just dug deep enough. Up in the sky, Meredith remained unaware of Donovan's continued digging. She concluded her flight by chatting with a few other passengers, noting their feedback. People generally seemed happy with Skyway Connect, praising the staff's friendliness but mentioning minor complaints about meal variety, seat comfort, and occasional scheduling glitches. Meredith jotted down these observations, ready to address them in the next corporate meeting. This was exactly why she did these undercover trips, to see the unvarnished truth of her airline's operations, both the positives and areas needing improvement. As the plane descended toward Chicago O'Hare, a swirl of emotions took hold of Meredith. She felt a mix of pride for the flight crew and frustration over her earlier encounter with Officer Myers. Little did she know that their paths would cross again soon under far more dramatic and revealing circumstances. The entire fiasco would result in a shocking public confrontation unlike anything she had ever experienced. Upon landing at Chicago O'Hare, Meredith disembarked with the other passengers. She offered a quiet thanks to the flight attendants at the door, who smiled back, unaware that their CEO had been on board. She felt a pang of satisfaction that, despite the earlier run-in, the flight had been smooth and largely positive. In the terminal, she ducked into a restroom to compose herself, preparing to step back into the role of corporate executive on the move. She had plans to meet with a few local managers from the airline, but she would maintain the same incognito approach. She wanted unfiltered honesty, not the curated version people often presented to the CEO. Shortly after, she booked an Uber to take her downtown, where a small conference room had been reserved under the alias Miss Cole. She texted a few staff members, department heads, and mid-level managers, asking them to come by for a brief meeting about operational updates. The staff believed they were meeting with an inspector from headquarters. It was one of Meredith's tactics. When people didn't know the boss was in front of them, they tended to be more genuine about their problems and daily experiences. The meeting was productive. A ground operations manager mentioned recurring software glitches that disrupted flight schedules. A customer service supervisor praised the flight attendants but complained about understaffing during peak hours. Meredith listened intently, taking copious notes. She asked follow-up questions and probed for further details. The staff members appreciated her interest, though they still didn't suspect who she really was. After all, she wore no fancy suit and flaunted no executive aura. She was simply a poised, inquisitive woman gathering information. After nearly 2 hours, she thanked them all, promising to relay their feedback to higher-ups. The managers and supervisors left, none the wiser. Once alone, Meredith opened her personal phone, which she had kept off for privacy reasons, and turned it on. Instantly, a flood of messages popped up. Most were mundane corporate reminders or quick questions about upcoming schedules. But one message made her pause. It was from her personal assistant. "Kimberly needs to speak ASAP. Some officer called, something about an investigation. He's from Atlanta. Please advise." Meredith felt her heart rate spike. Officer Myers. He must have looked up her name from the flight manifest or searched through what was accessible in the system. She clenched her jaw, a flurry of thoughts swirling in her mind. If she confronted him directly, she'd risk revealing her identity. On the other hand, ignoring it might escalate the situation further. She needed to proceed cautiously. She dialed Kimberly, who answered on the first ring. "Kimberly, what's going on?" Meredith asked. "There's a man named Officer Donovan Myers. He claims he's investigating potential fraudulent travel or suspicious activity tied to a passenger on your flight this morning. He somehow got directed to the corporate line. I didn't tell him anything, but he's persistent, Kimberly explained, her voice tense. Meredith closed her eyes, inhaling slowly. All right, don't reveal anything for now. If he calls again, just say we need official documentation for any investigation. I'll handle it. She ended the call, her mind racing. In theory, Donovan had no grounds to pursue anything. Meredith's travel arrangements were completely legitimate. But if he kept digging, he might discover that Meredith Cole was, in fact, the CEO. The problem was that his suspicious mindset, fueled by prejudice, could trigger a public relations nightmare if he started making baseless accusations. And if she were forced to reveal her identity just to shut him down, she'd lose the element of surprise she used for her inspections. She decided to fly back to Atlanta that evening to handle the matter. Enough was enough. She had the data she needed from this trip, and she didn't want Donovan's interference causing further complications. If he was still snooping around, she'd confront him in her office on her terms. She booked a flight back on a major carrier that operated an evening service to Atlanta. Let him try to question that, she thought, steeling herself as she made her way back to O'Hare. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a local manager informing her that the next flight to Atlanta had been delayed due to a mechanical issue. She adjusted her plans, rebooking onto a slightly later flight. She spent the next few hours in the airline lounge, scanning through emails and finalizing some proposals. It was a productive lull, though she couldn't fully relax with Donovan's looming interference on her mind. Finally, the time came to board her flight home. She felt a twinge of relief. Tonight, she'd be sleeping in her own bed, and tomorrow, she could address Donovan properly. She boarded the plane, found her seat, and prepared for takeoff. Little did she know, Donovan had been busy making phone calls back in Atlanta. Using questionable means, he obtained a partial passenger manifest from the morning flight, cross-referenced it, and discovered that Meredith Cole was associated with airline operations. That was enough to fuel the flames of his baseless suspicions. He managed to find out that she would be returning that evening. Whether he was pulling strings or simply bullying a contact into sharing scheduling details was unclear. But by the time Meredith's plane landed around 11 p.m. in Atlanta, Donovan was waiting. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was quieter at this late hour, but still far from deserted. Travelers waited near baggage claim, rideshare drivers hovered with their phones, and overhead announcements continued at less frequent intervals. Meredith, tired from the day, walked toward baggage claim to retrieve the small suitcase she had checked. Her footsteps echoed in the relatively empty corridor. That's when she saw him, Officer Donovan Myers, leaning against a pillar, arms folded across his chest, scanning the arriving passengers. The moment he spotted Meredith, his eyes narrowed. She paused, considering whether to walk the other way, but realized it would be futile. She was too exhausted for any more cat-and-mouse games. She approached him directly. "Officer Myers," she greeted, her voice calm but tight with underlying frustration. "I hear you've been calling my office." He tipped his chin in acknowledgement. "I have. We need to talk. You weren't very forthcoming earlier." Meredith suppressed a bitter laugh. "I gave you my ID, my boarding pass. You went through my belongings. What else do you need?" Donovan's jaw set. "Let's just say I've got more questions about who you really are and what you were doing on that flight." A spark of anger flared in Meredith's chest. "And you think that justifies harassing me?" He stepped closer, his voice low. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. The information I've gathered suggests there's more to you than meets the eye. According to flight records, you have some ties to Skyway Connect, that airline, and yet you show up as an ordinary passenger. Care to explain?" Meredith realized the time for concealment might be over, but she refused to unravel the entire truth under intimidation. "This line of questioning is out of line," she said. "I've broken no laws, and you have no grounds to detain or interrogate me. If you have a complaint, file it through official channels." Donovan smirked, as though her defiance confirmed his prejudices. Why don't we take a ride to the airport security office and sort this out properly? At that moment, a couple of passing travelers paused, sensing the tension. Meredith held her head high. "If you insist," she said. "But let me be clear, you have no authority to hold me without cause. If we go to that office, I'll be calling my lawyer." Donovan shrugged. "If that's what you want." Meredith followed him through a side corridor that led to the airport security offices. The walk felt surreal, each step magnifying her mix of fury and a sense of bizarre inevitability. Once inside, a bored-looking supervisor glanced up from a small desk. Donovan muttered something about needing a private room. They ended up in a plain interview room with harsh fluorescent lighting and sterile walls. Meredith crossed her arms over her chest, exasperated but refusing to show fear. "All right, officer, you've brought me here. Now talk," she said. Donovan paced the small room. "I learned that you're affiliated with Skyway Connect in some capacity, but your past didn't indicate you were an airline employee. You were traveling as a regular passenger. Now, why would that be?" Meredith's patience snapped. "Let's cut the charade. I was traveling undercover to check on my airline's operations. You want to know the truth? I'm the CEO of Skyway Connect, and I fly incognito to ensure that all passengers, regardless of background, get the service they deserve." The room fell silent. Donovan froze, eyes wide with disbelief, then burst out in a half-laugh, half-scoff. "CEO? That's rich," he sneered. "You really expect me to believe that you're some high-powered executive traveling around like—" He gestured dismissively at her unassuming attire. Meredith locked eyes with him, her calmness reasserting itself. "Yes, I do, because it's the truth. Now, if you want proof here." She took out her phone, tapping through a digital folder containing corporate documents. She opened a file showing an official employment contract from Skyway Connect, complete with her signature and the corporate seal. She turned the screen toward him. Donovan's face clouded over with confusion. He glanced at the document, uncertain whether it was genuine. "This could be a forgery," he muttered, but his confidence wavered. Meredith sighed. "Call the main office. Ask for Kimberly Reed, my personal assistant. She'll confirm everything. But be prepared to answer why you've been harassing the CEO of an airline with no legitimate grounds." Donovan faltered for a moment, his prejudice and suspicion mixing with the dawning realization that he might be in serious trouble. Still, he clung to the last remnants of his bias. "People can fake anything these days," he growled. "You can't blame me for being cautious. You don't exactly look like—" Meredith's eyes blazed. "Like what, officer? Like a CEO? Or is it that I don't look like how you think a CEO should look because I'm a black woman?" He said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. "Your racism is obvious," she continued, her voice steady but laced with anger. "You singled me out for no reason at the gate, then doubled down on your unfounded suspicions. You're abusing your authority to perpetuate your bias." "I've done absolutely nothing illegal." A ripple of tension spread through Donovan's stance. He tried to regain the upper hand. "Don't throw around accusations like that. I'm just doing my job." Meredith leaned forward, placing her hands on the table between them. "Your job is to protect and serve, not harass and demean. Let's call my lawyer, or better yet, let's call my entire corporate communications team. By the time I'm done, there will be no doubt about who I am and how you acted without justification." As the words left her mouth, the door to the small office opened, and the security supervisor from earlier stepped in, brow furrowed. "What's going on here?" he demanded, looking from Donovan to Meredith. He glanced at the document on Meredith's phone screen, recognized the official tone, and his eyes widened. "Officer Myers, you better have a good reason for this. I just got a call from the front desk. Miss Reed from Skyway Connect is on the line. She says Miss Cole is their CEO." Donovan blanched. It was as if the final pillar of his doubt came crashing down. He stared at Meredith, swallowing hard. The notion that he had cornered a powerful executive, someone with the resources and public platform to expose him, finally registered. He stammered, stepping back from the table. Meredith squared her shoulders, turning to the supervisor. Yes, let's go ahead and finalize this. She took her phone back. I'll be calling legal counsel. You'll be hearing from my office, and we'll see how the airport administration handles a racist officer who unlawfully detains a CEO for looking suspicious. The supervisor shot Donovan a sharp glare. Officer Myers, you need to leave the room now. Donovan hesitated, fists clenched, but he had no choice. He stormed out without another word. The supervisor turned to Meredith, apologetic. Miss Cole, I'm sorry for this incident. I had no idea. Meredith cut him off gently. Your apology is noted, but this is bigger than me. He targeted me because of the color of my skin. No one deserves that. I will be following up. Now, am I free to go? The supervisor nodded, looking distraught. Yes, of course. Meredith gathered her things, her heart pounding. She stepped out into the hallway. The air was cooler, and her mind was aflame with a swirl of anger, relief, and renewed determination. That night, she drove home in near silence, replaying the confrontation in her mind. Donovan's face, his sneering skepticism, his blatant discrimination. She thought about how often people of color faced exactly this treatment daily, without the advantage of being a CEO who could stand up and reveal a powerful truth. Unbeknownst to Meredith, the story was far from over. By the time she reached home, a news tip had already trickled out through an airport staff member who overheard fragments of conversation. The rumor was that a racist cop had detained a black woman, only to discover she was the CEO of the airline. Phones were buzzing, emails were flying, and social media was about to erupt in outrage. The karmic wave was beginning to swell, and Officer Donovan Mears was standing right in its path. Early the next morning, Meredith awoke to a barrage of notifications. Her phone vibrated relentlessly. Text messages from friends, colleagues, even family members, all sending links to a viral news story. Local Atlanta news outlets had picked up the headline, "Local cop allegedly harasses airline CEO at Hartsfield-Jackson." Though the article didn't mention Donovan by name, instead referring to an unnamed officer, it was enough to ignite a flood of social media responses. Some supportive, others enraged, and some disbelieving. Meredith groaned. She had hoped to handle the situation more discreetly, but now it was out in the open. She scrolled through her phone, reading statements from people outraged by what had occurred. A tweet from a local civil rights activist demanded the officer be fired. Another tweet from a well-known journalist called for a deeper investigation into systemic bias at the airport. Influencers and everyday citizens alike were weighing in, turning the whole incident into a national conversation. Meanwhile, at the Atlanta Police Department's airport division, Donovan's day began on a sour note. He walked into the briefing room and found people whispering, glancing nervously in his direction. His commanding officer, Captain Roland Reyes, summoned him into the office with a stern expression. On the desk lay a printout of the story, spread open. "Officer Myers," Captain Reyes said, his voice dripping with disappointment. "We have a problem, a very big problem." Donovan's cheeks burned as he surveyed the headline. "Look, sir, it's not as bad as it sounds. You were just what exactly?" Reyes interrupted. "According to the complaint filed by Miss Meredith Cole, who happens to be one of the top executives in the aviation industry, you detained her without probable cause, harassed her based on her appearance, and refused to release her until a supervisor intervened." Donovan struggled to maintain composure. "She was acting suspicious. I had a tip about possible contraband." Reyes slammed a hand on his desk. "A tip that never materialized into any evidence. You singled her out, rummaged through her belongings, and then still tracked her down on her return flight, again without proof. This has all the signs of racial profiling, Myers. It makes the department look terrible." Donovan clenched his jaw. "Sir, you know I've got a strong record." Reyes shook his head. "Your record isn't spotless. We've had complaints in the past, but they were never substantiated enough for disciplinary action. Now, the mayor's office is calling me demanding an explanation. Do you understand how serious this is?" Donovan remained silent, anger and fear clashing in his mind. The truth was, he had never expected any real pushback, since so many incidents in the past had been swept under the rug. But detaining a high-profile CEO changed everything. Reyes folded his arms, exhaling sharply. "I'm placing you on administrative leave effective immediately, pending an internal investigation. Hand over your badge and your gun." Stunned, Donovan reached down to unclasp his badge. "But sir—"
No arguments, Reyes snapped.
"And if Miss Cole decides to press charges, we might be looking at a lawsuit. Get out of my office." Donovan left with his dignity in tatters, grappling with the realization that karma had arrived in full force. But things were about to escalate even further as the story continued to spread, magnified by the unstoppable power of the internet. Meanwhile, Meredith was on a conference call with her company's legal and PR teams. A media frenzy had erupted, with journalists calling for statements and activists demanding interviews. Meredith was being praised for exposing the officer's racist profiling. Internally, her board members were concerned about how this sudden spotlight might affect the airline's reputation. Though Meredith was the victim, she listened, weary but resolute. "We should release a statement about the incident," she told her PR manager, Darius. "I want to focus on the larger issue of discrimination in air travel and law enforcement. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who faces this." Darius agreed. "But also, Miss Cole, the media is specifically requesting your personal account. They want to hear you speak. Our social channels are blowing up." Meredith thought for a moment. "I'll address it directly. That way, we can control the narrative rather than let rumors spiral." Within hours, a press conference was scheduled for that afternoon in a large conference room near the main terminal, with the Atlanta skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Cameras were positioned in neat rows, and journalists with notepads and microphones waited impatiently. A few members of the public managed to slip in. The room buzzed with anticipation. Stories had circulated online that the officer had forcibly pulled Meredith out of line and hurled slurs. Some details were exaggerated, others underreported. Everyone was eager for clarity. Meredith stepped up to the podium, dressed in a simple navy blue blazer. Her demeanor was calm yet steely. The flashes of cameras lit up her face. She thanked everyone for coming, took a breath, and began. "Good afternoon. My name is Meredith Cole, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of Skyway Connect. I stand here today to address an incident of unlawful detention and harassment. The moment I experienced at this very airport 2 nights ago." She paused, scanning the room. "An officer singled me out, searched my personal items, questioned my identity, and refused to accept my valid credentials until a supervisor intervened. The officer's actions were not only baseless, but also driven by racial profiling." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Meredith cleared her throat. "Although I am fortunate enough to have the resources and platform to fight back, many travelers, especially those who are Black or belong to other marginalized groups, do not. This incident shines a light on a broader systemic issue. It is my hope that by sharing my story, we can inspire meaningful discussion and policy changes that ensure everyone is treated with dignity, no matter their race or background." A reporter from a local TV station spoke up. "Miss Cole, have you made a decision on whether to file a lawsuit against the officer or the police department?" Meredith pressed her lips together. "My team is reviewing all legal options. Our goal is not financial gain, but accountability. We want to ensure this behavior does not go unpunished or unchecked." Another reporter asked, "How do you plan to address your own airline staff about this? Are you concerned it might damage your relationships with law enforcement?" Meredith shook her head. "Skyway Connect values safety and respects law enforcement. We partner with security agencies across our network. However, we cannot and will not condone unlawful harassment. This isn't about damaging relationships, it's about demanding integrity. We stand by the principles of equality and fairness." A flurry of other questions came, some more pointed than others, but Meredith answered each one calmly. She concluded the press conference by saying, "I encourage everyone to speak out when they witness injustice. It may be uncomfortable, but silence only perpetuates wrongdoing. Thank you. The applause that followed felt solemn yet supportive. Within moments, news outlets broadcasted her statement nationwide. Social media erupted again, with trending hashtags calling for Donovan's dismissal. People praised Meredith's composure, her call for systemic change, and her refusal to stay silent. Across town, Donovan sat in his modest apartment, eyes fixed on the television screen covering the press conference. The moment he heard Meredith mention racial profiling, a lump formed in his throat. Panic surged within him as cameras panned to protesters outside the airport, holding signs that read, "End racial profiling now," and "Justice for all passengers." He recognized a few faces, fellow officers from the department, watching him with condemnation. He switched channels only to see more of the same coverage. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages, some from old friends outraged by his actions, others from people mocking or threatening him. He was effectively a pariah. The department had placed him on administrative leave, but the internal investigation was almost certainly heading toward termination. His union representative warned him that they might not be able to protect him if the evidence of racial bias was conclusive. Donovan tried to rationalize his actions, but each time he replayed the incident in his head, he knew that if the passenger had been a white man in a suit, he likely wouldn't have given him a second glance. He was guilty whether he could admit it to himself or not. The reality was that the tide of public and institutional opinion had turned decisively against him. He flicked off the TV, grabbed his car keys, and decided to drive aimlessly, his mind thick with regret, denial, and a strange anger at the entire situation, as if it were something that had happened to him, rather than the direct result of his own choices. But deep down, a voice kept telling him, "You did this. You singled her out. Now you're paying the price." A week later, a disciplinary hearing took place at the Atlanta Police Department's downtown headquarters. Donovan sat at a long table, facing a panel of officials, including Captain Reyes, an internal affairs officer, and a city attorney. Meredith, flanked by her legal counsel, appeared via video conference. She had chosen not to attend in person, believing her presence might overshadow the objective nature of the process. After the formalities, the city attorney began presenting the evidence. Donovan's history of questionable stops, multiple informal complaints that never progressed due to lack of evidence, and the testimony of Meredith Cole and the security supervisor who had witnessed Donovan's actions at the airport security office. The supervisor recounted how Donovan refused to release Meredith, despite there being no valid reason to detain her. When Donovan had the chance to speak, he tried to mount a defense. "I received intel about a suspicious passenger," he insisted. "I was just following up on that lead." The city attorney frowned. "Officer Myers, can you provide any record of this intel? Who gave you the tip?" Donovan's face reddened. "It was an anonymous source," he mumbled. The attorney pressed, "You have no record of this call or source, no official report filed, and no supporting evidence. Is that correct?" Donovan opened and closed his mouth before finally sighing. "Yes," he admitted quietly. Captain Reyes then asked, "How do you explain detaining Miss Cole after you had already searched her belongings and found nothing?" Donovan felt sweat trickling down the back of his neck. "She was too calm. It felt off to me." A silence fell over the room as the panel exchanged disbelieving glances. The city attorney turned to the video screen. "Miss Cole, do you have anything to add?" Meredith's image appeared, steady and composed. "Yes, the entire situation was based on Officer Myers' biased assumption that I didn't belong in the airline's business class, or that I was somehow suspicious because I am a confident black woman traveling alone. This was not a mere lapse in judgment, it was deliberate discrimination. I hope the department takes appropriate action and addresses the systemic issues that allow such officers to act with impunity." Her words echoed in the silent chamber. Donovan looked down at his hands, unable to make eye contact with anyone. The hearing concluded in under an hour. The panel deliberated briefly and then announced their decision. Donovan Myers was to be terminated from the force, effective immediately. Furthermore, The Atlanta Police Department would open a broader investigation into their training programs to prevent future incidents of racial profiling. Donovan's shoulders sagged. He felt numb as he left the hearing room. Reporters gathered outside, demanding a statement, but he said nothing, rushing to his car. Within hours, the media reported that the officer at the center of the scandal had been fired. Public response was swift, a mix of relief, vindication, and calls for deeper reforms. In the following weeks, life settled into a new normal for Donovan. He was out of a job, facing condemnation not only from the public but also from his family, who didn't share his prejudiced views. He found it impossible to secure new employment in law enforcement. News had spread, and no department wanted the baggage of hiring a cop fired for racial profiling. Legal actions were also underway. While Meredith didn't pursue massive damages herself, civil rights groups pressured the city to hold Donovan accountable, including potential lawsuits for harassment and emotional distress. When reporters cornered Donovan outside his apartment, he tried to appear contrite, but it was too little, too late. He would forever be branded as the cop whose prejudice ruined his career. Meanwhile, Meredith decided to channel the energy from this ordeal into something positive. She increased corporate funding for bias training among Skyway Connect employees and launched a new passenger advocacy program aimed at protecting travelers from discrimination. She also partnered with local nonprofits to hold workshops at various airports, educating staff on recognizing and addressing implicit bias. One morning, as Meredith was reviewing final details for a major training initiative, her phone buzzed. A text from her assistant, Kimberly, read, "We're trending positively. Public sees you as a champion for equality in travel. Good job, boss." A small smile curved across Meredith's lips. This was never how she envisioned finding herself in the national spotlight. But if the incident helped thousands of other travelers feel safer and more respected, it would be worth it. In a final twist of fate, an internal investigation revealed that Donovan had been falsifying some of his so-called tips and exaggerating others to justify random searches, primarily of Black and brown travelers. His entire history came under scrutiny, and additional lawsuits were filed by people who realized they had been similarly profiled. Donovan found himself overwhelmed with legal fees, forced to sell his car and eventually his home. The very prejudice that had empowered him for years was now the force that was destroying his life. This was the harsh karma waiting for him, his downfall directly proportional to the pain he had caused others. Weeks bled into months, and the media's interest slowly waned, replaced by the next big headline. However, the scandal remained a turning point. Several other airports across the country took note, implementing stricter guidelines on how officers engaged with passengers. Skyway Connect reported a renewed surge of goodwill from customers who appreciated Meredith's transparency and advocacy. Meredith herself continued traveling, occasionally incognito, though her anonymity had been compromised by the viral news story. She adapted by changing her approach, traveling on different routes and times. Still, her mission remained steadfast. She wanted to see firsthand that her airline was living up to its promise of treating every passenger with dignity and respect. On one such flight, a young Black woman hesitated at the gate, fumbling with her boarding pass, visibly anxious. Meredith gently asked if everything was all right. The woman looked up, recognized Meredith's face from a viral news clip, and lit up with relief. "You're Miss Cole. Thank you for what you did. It means a lot to people like me." A warmth spread through Meredith as she ushered the woman toward the gate agent, who quickly resolved the boarding issue. They parted ways on the jet bridge. As Meredith settled into her seat, she realized that despite the challenges, controversies, and the sometimes heartbreaking realities of racial bias, the fight was worth it. Every step of progress made travel and life a little fairer, a little kinder. As the plane took off, she gazed out the window at the receding ground, thinking of the arcs of fate that had brought Officer Myers to his reckoning and her to her role as an advocate for change. She hoped that one day, stories like hers would no longer be necessary. But until then, she would remain vigilant, ready to shine a light on discrimination wherever it appeared. After all, she believed in flight, the possibility of rising above limitations, above fear, and above prejudice. soaring into a future where equality wasn't just a dream, but a collective reality. And so ends the gripping tale of a woman wronged by prejudice, only to rise as a beacon of hope in exposing the injustice at Hartsfield-Jackson. Meredith Cole reminded the world that power isn't just about status. It's about using your voice to create a better, fairer society. Officer Myers learned that unchecked bias eventually catches up, that karma has a way of delivering justice where it's deserved most. It's a reminder that every act, no matter how small, can have huge repercussions, good or bad. If the story moved you, if it made you think twice about how we treat each other in places as ordinary as an airport gate, don't let the message end here. Like this video, share it with friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that shine a light on the triumph of integrity over injustice. Together, let's keep pushing for kindness, fairness, and unity, one story at a time.